Welcome back, everybody, to today's second class in this series that we're offering on cooperative communities, intentional communities, Paramhansa Yogananda's vision for the future. And today, I would like to continue a little bit our discussion that we started last week and bring it to a conclusion before we start to move on to, the nuts and bolts, you might say, and things that practical applications and how to start a community, lessons learned, and those sorts of things. And today, I've chosen as a title for today's class, Self-Interest versus Cooperation. And the reason I chose that is because in this age, these two competing forces, I think, are at play. They don't need to be competing forces, and I think to bring harmonization between these two concepts of working for my self-interest, which is a hallmark of the age in which we're in, and learning to be able also at the same time to cooperate. Now, they seemingly can be on two sides of the balance scale, but actually they don't have to be. And so last week I asked the question, why haven't World Brotherhood colonies spread like wildfire, as Paramhansa Yogananda predicted? And my answer was, well, they haven't yet, but the time will come. Right now, there are experiments, there are few, but really right now, in order for a concept such as that to be able to spread like wildfire, according to that phrase, consciousness needs to change. There's lots of work that needs to be done. And so I made that point. One, those of us who want to spread these teachings, want to make this concept grow, want to see a better future, we need to work at it. Where there's work that needs to be done, we need to plow the field to get it ready for these seeds to be planted. And there is that aspect, and this is, you could say, what we're doing through Ananda Sangha. We're spreading the teachings of Paramhansa Yogananda, making his name known. But it's more than that alone. It's a broader concept. It isn't about our guru Paramhansa Yogananda as much as it is about what he taught, the truths that he expressed and brought. And we to try to share those, and not just share them verbally, but try to express them in our actual lives and in our daily activities, and through the outward expression of what we do with our lives, and the creation of World Brotherhood colonies for some of us. And to participate in that is one of the aspects by which we can be of service. And so, yes, we have to, you could say, cultivate the fields with right attitude, with higher consciousness. And at the same time, there are brave souls out there that we want to encourage people to take up this and actually try to put something into practice, because we need examples. And even if there's not many, this is a time for experimentation. It is a time for people to learn what works, what doesn't work, and slowly, as consciousness changes, as I believe and has been predicted, and as our masters have explained, will change over this coming age that we've entered. This idea will be taken up, and as Yogananda predicted, it will become a social model for the future. And so, here we are right now, though, 21st century, first quarter of it. And I'm often asked, because I've been involved in this community movement for half a century, really. It's been a while. I'm sometimes asked, what is it? I'm interested in starting community. What does it take to start a community? Is it land? Do I want to go out and buy some land? Maybe we could start a community. What resources I need to gather, tools and all sorts of, physical things, other people, maybe I need to learn certain skills, and all of these sorts of, very, very, practical things. And people drift into that. And maybe I need to store food and be prepared and all of these sorts of things. And what should I store? Start a garden. Well, all of these things might be good and they might be useful, but it really doesn't begin there. If we want to start a community, it all begins with people. as I like to kind of sometimes ruefully say, people, because that's difficult to working with people, because you have to deal with all the, maybe people who disagree with you, different foibles, trying to get people moving in one direction. That's a skill, to be able to work with people, have those leadership skills. But we need to realize that a community is people. And its people, as Swami Kriyananda used to always say, are much more and far more, are more important than things. And so we have to work with people, but it's not any people. It's people who have a wish and a willingness to cooperate. I mean, you sort of take that for granted. Oh, everybody wants to cooperate, surely. Is that really true? But it's those who have, and you might say by nature, a willingness to cooperate, a willingness to sacrifice. That's a word that people don't like to hear. But when I say, what does it mean to sacrifice? Sacrifice for an ideal. Because what we're speaking about here, when we're speaking about intentional communities, that's an idealization. And and if a person is not willing to sacrifice for an ideal, when the going gets rough, they revert back to the inherent tendency to think of me and mine. What do I need? What my self-interest? To cooperate means that we have to, you might say, give up a little bit. We have to sacrifice. So the sacrifice for an ideal, and a willingness also to work for the welfare of others, to have a natural tendency to be concerned about other people. And that demonstrates a certain maturity in a person. They're not just not involved in themselves completely. And we all have self-interest, but the willingness to look for the welfare of other people shows a mark of spiritual growth that I think is somewhat essential, particularly in this age, for the success of communities. So if you get people together who are willing to cooperate, they see a larger, something to see the welfare of other people, think of them, and they're willing to sacrifice for an ideal. And when we say sacrifice, it's really what it comes down to. It's the spiritual sacrifice that everybody makes if they want to perfect themselves, if they want to seek higher values in life. Sacrifice of my individual likes and dislikes for a greater good, to be able to have that. And you think, well, that's easy enough. But really, is it easy really to sacrifice those things? It takes a certain practice. It takes a growth, and we're in that process. But if at least we have that ideal, that aspiration toward that, we start with that, and then we have, obviously, people have to have an interest, and we start to bring those people together. And as we bring those people together, a magnetism under an ideal, a magnetism begins to develop. I remember I mentioned last week that when I first met Swami Kriyananda, he was writing his manuscript, Cooperative Communities, How to Start Them and Why. And he actually had said, let's get people together to see if there's some interest. And he gathered in his flat in San Francisco at that day, maybe 20, 25 people came together to discuss this possibility of, is it possible to start a community? What might we do? And as he writes, I attended actually one of those meetings, but the way Swamiji described it later, he says, people, it was not a pleasant experience. It was as I had thought it was. People seemed to think that I had some ulterior motive, and immediately things began to devolve into what kind of system might work, what won't work, and wider, individuality and freedoms, and all sorts of esoteric philosophical discussions began to arise, and arguments began to to come up. And they had they're sitting in a living room, even thinking about the idea, and divisions became divisive real quickly. Not that it was a negative, it was tending that way, but people were good-hearted. But there's a mental habit. Yes, it's a good idea, but. Yes, but. and you begin to see the faults. And it's very difficult to get energy moving all together in one direction in a positive way so that you can then begin to attract ideas, positive ideas begin to come. And so you could say the group forming to create Ananda Village had a little bit of work to do. But eventually later it did begin to coalesce. And I just, as a personal aside, I had mentioned I attended one of those meetings. People who wanted to start a community, and there was 20, 25 people there at the one I was. And later I did move to Ananda and help create Ananda. And of all those 25, I think no more than one or two of those people ever came. It was all in the clouds, you see. And this is what you get. And to get people who actually are willing to start and act and do something in the right spirit, it's not, when it comes to you could say, as they say, when the rubber meets the road, sometimes it turns out very different than you had hoped. But anyway, there's the dictionary. I was looking up the word cooperation, and it's defined as working or acting together for a common purpose or benefit, a joint action. But we need more than that. It's also what we're speaking about here is intentional cooperation, to actually want to cooperate, because many times communities form and have formed throughout history for many different reasons. And I think as a society, it's always been somewhat cooperative, because just the physical obstacles to living in this world, to being able to accomplish something, people coming together for commercial purposes. Why do communities start next to a river, maybe, or a stream? Well, there's water, that's useful. Maybe if it's a big enough river, people can travel on the river, trade happens, people come, I'm going to go there because I can barter, and there's all sorts of reasons. And historically, communities come all sorts of reasons. They come crossroads, commerce, trade, jobs, and there's always been natural groupings of people who share common interests. You got people share, perhaps they're immigrants into a country, and so consequently people speak the same language and they congregate, they have background, so they come together and they form communities. I myself, my family, I was a child of immigrants into America, and I lived, my parents in that generation, they all had friends, but it was an immigrant community, and I grew up in that. And it was a natural thing, and the culture bound people, and language binds people. And if you look, though, in history for the communities coming up for purposeful reasons, not just accidental, of environmental whims and fancies of the situation, you see people have also formed communities over the years, and probably the most successful, long-lasting ones is people come together by something that binds them. And what is the most binding? Historically, it's been religion. Religion has been one of those binding forces, and there's been historical communities throughout history. People have come together because of their religious beliefs, a shared ideal of what life is all about that ends up transcending many of the differences. So you can have shopkeepers, you can have accountants, you can have laborers in the field. All of them, maybe outwardly they don't have so much in common, but something binds them, and it could be language and background and culture, but it's also the beliefs that where they're going as people, the values. And this tends to be the most binding. And I think in the day and age that we are right now, we look back even just in recent centuries, those communities that have been most successful have been religious. They don't have to be, though, but the fact is, if you don't have religion, something has to bind people. And I think right now, I would really encourage religious groups. It's a good way to start. Ananda's one example, but there could be a group of Methodists, or a group of Islamic believers, or what they could come together and experiment with these sorts of things, Buddhists, whatever it might be, because you're starting off on a level where people can agree on something. Where are we going in life? But but usually also you have to have common aspirations, common beliefs, mutual support back and forth. But usually communities come together. There's some sense of self-interest that historically have brought people together. And I think back historically, and I look, because I'm an American, I grew up in the American education, so I know a little bit about my American history. And a very good example, it's been often cited, is people came together to start the initial colonies, the Pilgrim colonies in the early 17th century. People came from England, United Kingdom, that area. They came, and eventually later from other places. Well, they came to America to start community. And in the process of that, and it was religiously motivated for most of them, not all of them, but for most of them, they were wanting to find a place where they could practice their religion. And those early pioneers coming, especially those coming in New England, the upper northern states, they came with that motivation. And we use them sometimes. Oh, they came and they lived, and they actually did. The first ones, they lived communally. And the interesting part of the history, though, that some people might forget, is it wasn't because they wanted to live communally. It's because they had to. One, they needed to protect themselves in the wilderness. They didn't know where they were. And second, they had a contract with the people who put up the funds for those pilgrims to go to America, and they had to pay them back. And as part of that contract, they would do certain labor in America to establish this colony, to send back material and send back resources back to England as a profit-making business for those people who had supported them to come. But so they lived together, and they had signed a contract with each other that they would live together communally for 10 years. When that 10 years expired, what happened? The community began to disperse. People wanted their own land. They wanted autonomy. And they didn't want to necessarily live together. They needed to keep some sense of community in order for self-protection, and of course to provide necessary opportunities for trade and so on. But it, again, reverted to somewhat of a secondary purpose, not a primary purpose. And I think it was to me, that gave an example. You have these two forces at play. People want autonomy, but at the same time, community is there. And of course, community in the early days of the pioneering days in America, it was something that they did somewhat because they were, for many of the communities that were religiously based, common belief, protection from the hostile forces. And so those two were mixed. And so as for century, 2 centuries or more, there was a very strong embedded sense of community as a good necessity. But at the same time, there was a strong desire for autonomy, the individual freedom. Everybody wanted their 40 acres of land and their own little farm and their own little... And those two forces were at play. And both of them, in America at least, are very, very strong. They would cooperate in times of adversity, warfare, those sorts of things, mutual self-defense. But you remove the threat, and there was a lot less desire to cooperate. And but still, it became embedded in the American tradition to get together. And of course, it led ultimately to the revolution away from England, breaking free, because they wanted to, as groups of people, they wanted their autonomy even further. But yet they were also self-sufficient, and they were working together. Now, this was years ago. It's a very good book. I read this years ago. It was called Democracy in America by Alexis Tocqueville, written in 1840. And it was in his day, it was a bestseller, I guess you'd say, because this was a Frenchman who had come, an aristocrat, who had come from France to explore America, to see what are they doing there, how are they succeeding. And he came, and he was surprised how America, it was flourished, democracy was flourishing at that time. And he made reference to these contrasts between the two, that people are very independent, very independently minded. They want to go off, they want to explore their movement of the people to the west to have their own land. But at the same time, he said, it's amazing. People will get together and cooperate for their common welfare at the drop of a hat. So he says, committees form for everything. Let's build a library. Committee forms, they build it. Let's build a church. People come together, they do it. We have to figure out a way to organize ourselves in this environment. We'll have self-government. It's a natural impulse to come together and cooperate. And he was very surprised at this because he didn't see that in France. Now, France in those days was very hierarchical and had a long tradition of hierarchy. And so if a group of people got together, who was going to, in America, a group of people get together to build something, who's going to be in charge? Well, they'd probably vote on it amongst themselves. They would say, well, Charles, he's going to be in charge for whatever reason. Maybe he's the most experienced. But they would come to a group decision on that, and it was natural for everything. In France, get together to build something. Who's in charge? It's the rich person's son. He's in charge because hierarchy had been passed down through the ages that the people who had money, who had wealth, who had status, they were in charge. And you can see that one of the movements that has been happening in the world as a whole over the last couple of centuries is to breaking down those artificial hierarchies of class, of wealth, of caste, of race. These are movements that are taking place and have taken place over the last couple of centuries and are going to increase. The rise of the individual is an aspect of this age that we are in. Dwapara Yuga was termed by Swami Sri Yukteswar one of the foundation stones of the rise of this wave of higher consciousness that's coming into the world very gradually over the millennia is the rise of the individual, whereas in past ages there was the organization, hierarchy, birth, all of these artificial reasons of how society was organized. And so, but with the rise of the individual comes the rise of individual will, comes the rise of individual ego, self-will. It's not necessarily all wise. The strength of the individual being egoic is also a characteristic of the age. So this is why the masters termed this age as an egoic age. Now, it sounds like it's a negative, but when we realize the direction that we're moving, it's not. The ego is being strengthened this age. It's a restless age. It's an age of self-will. And yet, that is necessary. Self-will, self-interest. Adam Smith and his classic book, Wealth of Nations, saying economies are best served when everybody works for their personal self-interest. And of course, that's the foundation of modern capitalism, everybody working for their individual self-interest. But it's not necessarily the highest way in terms of consciousness, but yet it is what we have today. Now, Adam Smith was wise enough to see that it would be better. Would it not, he postulates this question, would it not be better if people understood that their self-interest is more expansive if they think of the welfare of others? And that, he felt, would be a direction that people would ultimately go. Now, people don't remember Adam Smith for that caveat he put in there. But he himself saw that there was something higher than individual. Each person, you could say, greed is good. Says there was a movie about that. Greed is good. Everybody being greedy for their own self-interest leads to the highest economic benefit. Well, that may be true if consciousness is on a certain level, and maybe we are on that level, but that's not the direction that we could go ultimately. And of course, Karl Marx, he came and of course proposed communism. We all think of the highest welfare from each according to his abilities, to each according to their needs. Now that sounds really idealistic, and and many people were idealistically motivated by that. Wouldn't that be a better way to organize ourselves rather than just greed? Unfortunately, it may sound nice, but it doesn't seem to work. And because it becomes coercive. Economic systems, organizational systems have to be voluntary to truly be free. For a person to actualize and be happy, there needs to be that intentionalism in our actions, to intentionally cooperate, intentionally work for the welfare of others. To just do it because we're forced, that goes against the human spirit, and ultimately it becomes coercive, which is what communism put into play politically ended up being. It's coercive. So what you find is society, we have these two. Well, you have communism on one side, greedy capitalism on the other. Is there not a better alternative? Well, until consciousness changes, people won't be able to see it. Ultimately, what we're striving for in this age, and I think this is what has been predicted by the masters in the centuries to come, people will begin to learn the lesson that my happiness is increased if others are happy. To be able to see my happiness as interlinked with the happiness of all of us, that if I have self-interest, if my enlightened self-interest is to wish well for other people, when they do well, I feel better. And people will begin to see this, but it takes a bit of evolutionary change, a change in consciousness. And this is why, again, I'm a little bit repeating what I said last week, but this is why the ground must be cultivated with higher consciousness, to people to expand their sense of self beyond their own little self. Now, interestingly, I was mentioning how difficult it is for people to cooperate. People don't seem to want to sacrifice. But this isn't necessarily true in certain situations. Take a family, for instance, a married couple. They have children. They are going to naturally want to sacrifice. They will sacrifice for their small family. And so we can learn the lessons that people will naturally sacrifice because they see it in the higher interest. Their happiness is enhanced if they sacrifice for their family. But unfortunately, people in general have not yet been able to go beyond the boundary of us, as Yogananda would say, as Swami Kriyananda so often said, us four and no more, to see that boundary of family holding them back. And the challenge for us in the ages to come, in this coming age, the centuries to come, is to expand that boundary, to promote that boundary, to do whatever we can to see that it need not just be competition, cooperation itself as a virtue, being able to teach this virtue, to be able to share that virtue, and have it be able to actually be seen as a virtue, as opposed to only having individuality and self-interest to be the ethos of our time, which unfortunately for most people it is. And they would, such a person would say, why do I cooperate? Why do I have to cooperate? Well, if you get people like that in trying to make a community out of folks like that, it's not going to work. Why do I have to cooperate? And it sounds good, but because what it means is, that means I have to sacrifice my own individual autonomy for something other. But if we can learn to see that the something other brings about what we really want to expand our sense of self beyond our little confines into something larger. But that lesson of sacrifice is large hurdle right now. But it does not mean that everybody sees that as a hurdle. There are many, many people in the world who do naturally think of others, because just like families, they see others as part of their family. It's part of the fabric, as I said, learning to cooperate with other people. We see, yes, if I cooperate, we're going to get this job done better. People understand it, and they also have that natural tendency of heart. Those people who have that inclination, there are millions of those as well, but compared to the world at large, it's only a small number. But yet, there's enough in that cater to make a community happen. And I think this is our job. For those of us who are interested in this is our task, let's say. This is our challenge, our opportunity. Look at it, maybe even that's a better way to say it, to motivate such people to get together and to think of themselves as pioneers. We spoke about pioneers, but pioneers in a new way. And I think we can do that. And it's a skill that cooperation, it's a skill that can be taught, and it should be taught, and we can begin to do that. And it's really, when we come down to it, it's really a spiritual question. Is this need of this age as a whole is that of raising consciousness. My happiness is connected with the happiness of everybody, and I think this is the work that we need to do in the coming age. And this is what I mean when I say cultivating the soil. But at the same time, we do need to plant seeds. And I think this is going to take probably mostly young people, because they're the ones that tend to be more adventurous, just like Ananda village started with mostly young people. And it's a time when those people can get together and launch forth with experiments of many kinds, coming together. And in the weeks ahead, this is when we begin to speak of what works and what doesn't work based upon experience. I think this is what, if we can get enough people to be interested in that, we can launch forth and begin to plant those seeds that they would be cultivated and germinate into something that will have an impact, that will change the consciousness. Now, behind the scenes of all this, I think we must realize, if we haven't already, that I'm referring to the teachings of Paramhansa Yogananda's guru, Swami Kriyananda, who said there is a natural flow in this time in world history of a raising of consciousness for reasons that I need not explain here. I won't explain here. But this natural wave is a wave that we can ride on that. There is, you might say, behind the scenes, there is support that we are not moving into a dark age of chaos or negativity or apocalypse. That, although that's not to say we won't have difficulties, because out of difficulties, good things can come. But you could say if there's difficulties, refining our consciousness. They're for the larger good, that is not all that far away. Paramhansa Yogananda even said, yes, the world itself may have to go through great difficulties, but out the other side of those difficulties, because difficulties sometimes we need to learn our lessons, out the other side, there will be at least a period of time, and not too far in the future, for 300 years of peace and harmony. After that, he didn't say. But we're in an upward flow. So let's, you might say, ride that wave now and plant those seeds. So this is the task before us, to go beyond likes and dislikes. You could say, be able to sacrifice, be willing to sacrifice for a higher goal. And I wanted to conclude this week's by discourse on this topic that we have to, one of the goals of this age and that the time we're in is to expand our consciousness to see from self-interest to enlightened self-interest. But I don't mean to say that that's enough. It just happens to be, you might say, the task immediately before us. There is a larger goal. Is Dwapara Yuga, the Yuga that we're in, it points towards something larger, which is not just living in enlightened self-interest, but to transcend self-interest entirely. Now, this, of course, is another subject entirely also, but it's where we're pointing. And I think for those people who have these goals, which I've expressed to date, realize that there's something larger. And this vision of self-interest, enlightened self-interest, points to ultimately going beyond that to realize that our true happiness comes when we abandon self-interest entirely and live our lives for God realization. That's what the great masters ultimately come for, because that's what all of us really want. That realization that our true freedom comes not for enhancing the ego or satisfying the ego, but from transcending the ego. And so but life is directional. And in every age, there will be some that understand the higher truths and some that need to go through many experiences. But it's good to realize that we're in this upward moving wave. And I'll end with this. According to Sri Yukteswar, before this age, and I find this to be an encouraging thought, he says, before this age of Dwapara Yuga in which we're moving right now, and we're just at the very beginning, this age of a higher consciousness, restless though it may be, before it reaches its end, and roughly over a couple thousand years from now, he made the prediction. He said, mankind will learn two overarching lessons. And you could say, we're in school. Our two lessons that we're going to learn is, he says, one, the experience of happiness, the feeling of being happy, is the result of movements of life force within our own selves, our own body. And we're going to learn that I can be in control of happiness. I'll learn the ability to raise my energy within myself to attain that which I really want in life. So I'll be able to recognize that. Right now, that is very dim in most people's recognition. But he said this will become common. People, and this is why Paramhansa Yogananda said self-realization will become the religion of the future. Self-realization, not the organization, but the actuality of self-realization. And two, the second lesson that mankind will learn over the coming millennia, the experience of personal happiness is enhanced through the expansion of one's awareness and sympathies to include others. This is a basic, my own happiness, and then expanding that by seeing happiness in everybody. That happiness is enhanced when others' happiness is taken into consideration and also enhanced. And these two principles are the foundation stones upon which a cooperative, intentional community can be built. The individuals questing for higher ideals and the willingness to expand their consciousness to include others. And if we can learn those two as foundation stones, then we have a chance to make a successful cooperative community. Now, perfection isn't achieved in a day, but if that becomes an ideal for us, then I think let's begin by starting more communities and making these ideals of the great masters come to fruition in this age right now. And then those seeds will then expand and reach out and inspire others. So next week, I invite you back because we'll now move from the philosophical into some of the practical applications. So thank you very much for joining me this week in our second class, and I look forward to seeing you next week.